Lay that pistol down, babe, lay that pistol down. Pistol packing mama, lay that pistol down. Oh, drinking beer in a cabaret, was I having fun?
What's up, all you history lovers, and welcome back to the History Newscast. You guys are in for a real treat with today's show. This episode will discuss Japanese internment camps and include actual footage from the camps and interviews from Asahi Nakamura and Henry Stimson. Well, without further ado, let's get right into the content. Here's some actual footage of an internment camp. As you can see, conditions were very grim. The house had little insulation, they were uncomfortable, and they were cramped. The woman in the video is a teacher at a school in the camp. Let's take a listen to what she has to say to the American officer.
Hello, officer. How can I help you?
What are you doing?
I'm just resting and I was finishing teaching at the school nearby.
Can you help me in the kitchen to make some food because one of the workers is sick?
I can't. I'm really tired because the house has very bad beds and no heating. It's really cramped, so I don't get a lot of sleep.
Here's a Japanese woman working during the day. The labor was brutal. The workers suffered through hot summers and very cold winters. Work conditions were also dismal, so it was very common for workers to get injured on the job.
When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, our west coast became a potential combat zone. Living in that zone were more than 100,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of them American citizens, 1/3 aliens. We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous. Most were loyal, but no one knew what would happen among this concentrated population if Japanese forces should try to invade our shores. Military authorities therefore determined that all of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move.
Welcome back, everyone. The first interview we'll be showing today is of Asahi Nakamura. Before we begin, I'd like to give a brief background on Mr. Nakamura. He is not famous or very significant, however, he's been directly affected by the Japanese internment camps and offers worthwhile insight. I hope you enjoy the interview. Hello, Mr. Nakamura. How are you today?
Not too well, I'm afraid.
Why is that?
Ever since Pearl Harbor, my family and I have been treated very poorly. The other day I went to the grocery store to get food and the grocer refused to sell to me.
That's awful. Has anything else happened to you?
Unfortunately, yes. The other day, a mob broke into my store and vandalized everything. I'm just a Japanese American trying to make a living. I don't know why everyone's targeting me.
That is awful. I'm very sorry, Mr. Nakamura. Have you experienced any other mistreatment because of your race?
Yes, actually. Recently, I was informed that my family and I are being evacuated from the West Coast.
Well, why were you evacuated?
Well, President Roosevelt issued the 9066 executive order, which allowed the War Department to declare any part of the United States a military zone. Shortly after the executive order, Henry Stimson declared much of the West Coast, including where I live, a military zone.
Do you think being forced to evacuate your home is a violation of your rights?
I completely do. My friend Fred Korematsu argued that this was a violation of his rights and pursued a lawsuit against the United States. Eventually, his case reached the Supreme Court and was known as Korematsu versus United States.
What did the Supreme Court end up ruling?
They ruled the relocation constitutional because it was not based on race but on military urgency.
I've heard that Regiment 442 is almost entirely Japanese. What do you think about Japanese Americans being allowed to fight for this country and not being allowed to live in their own homes?
I respect those who join the regiment, but I myself would not join because of the treatment that I've received.
I don't blame you, but that's all we have for today. Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Nakamura.
Thanks for your time.
I hope you guys enjoyed that as much as I did. Next, we will have our interview with Mr. Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, a very different man from Mr. Nakamura. Keep in mind that Mr. Stimson and many other Americans were terrified of the Japanese because of Pearl Harbor, and many believed that the Japanese were going to try and attack America. Well, stay tuned for the interview.
To leave voluntarily. The trouble for the voluntary evacuees soon threatened in their new locations. So the program was quickly put on a planned and protected basis. Thereafter, the American citizen Japanese and Japanese aliens made plans in accordance with orders. Notices were posted. All persons of Japanese descent were required to register. They gathered in their own churches and schools, and the Japanese themselves cheerfully handled the enormous paperwork involved in the migration.
Hello, Mr. Stimson. How are you?
I'm pretty busy. I was just appointed Secretary of War.
Congratulations. What is your experience in the war leading up to this?
Well, President Taft originally appointed me as Secretary of War in 1911. During World War I, I served as a colonel in artillery. A few years later, I served as an envoy to Latin America and negotiated an end to the Nicaraguan Civil War in 1927. After my time in the war, President Coolidge appointed me to Governor General of the Philippines later that year.
That's impressive. What did you do after President Hoover was defeated in 1932?
I had retired, but FDR recalled me to the U.S. government and appointed me to Secretary of War.
What are some of your accomplishments under Roosevelt?
Recently, Roosevelt passed Executive Order 9066, which allowed me to declare any part of the country a war zone. Since Pearl Harbor, the west of the country is not safe, so I declared a war zone. This was mainly so that the Japanese wouldn't rebel. The State Department, however, was against this decision, but the military department still declared the west a war zone.
What were your goals during the war?
Well, I attempted to save the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and in 1930 I successfully limited the naval race among the largest naval powers at the London Naval Convention, although Japan later withdrew from that agreement in 1935. I also led the U.S. delegation to the Geneva Disarmament Conference in 1932.
What was your reaction to Japan's occupation of Manchuria in 1931?
I created the Stimson Doctrine, which stated that the United States would recognize no diminution of U.S. treaty rights brought about by aggression. After this doctrine, I unsuccessfully attempted to limit the economic effects of war debts, which failed due to the U.S. Congress passing the Hawley-Smoot Tariff.
That's all I have for today. Thank you for your time, Mr. Stimson.
Yeah, no problem. I enjoyed it. That's all we have for today. Thank you all for tuning in. And make sure to join us next week for some more amazing content on the History Newscast.
That pistol down, pistol packing mama, lay that pistol down.